Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Discussing a Murderer. This is Jeff Jones, and with me, as always, is the panel. We'll introduce them from the top and say top to the bottom and say, hey, Big Jeff, how are you doing today?
Hey, Jeff, it's good to be here, back for another episode. Last week was a rough one, and let's see if we can do a little bit better this week.
Well, thank you, Big Jeff. Kel, how are you doing today? This morning?
Hello, yes, it's morning here in Western Australia. It's good to be back. Yes, last week was a tough one. I can't see this one getting any better, but let's see what happens.
Yeah, we got to be as positive as we can. Isn't that right, Jack?
I sentiment Kel's words. Last week was rough. Anytime we deal with Brendan's situation, it's rough. And I don't see this rest of this getting any better moving into this episode. But we'll do the best we can. And hello, everybody in the live chat, and hello to my fellow panel members. Let's do it.
Thanks, Jack. And Dr. Silkman, have you prepared your iPad?
Well, I must admit, I've just got back my iPad from the repair shop. That's my fourth cracked screen. I hope Jack61 is looking after his better than me. But yes, in all fairness, last week's episode was a real rough one. And let's hope today's episode gets a little bit better. But, guys, we have to go through it. It's all part of the process. I'd like to welcome my fellow panel members and say hi to everyone in chat. Thank you.
Wasn't exactly what we wanted, but just like anything else, we'll accept it and deal with it. In 41 years, I'll be 66, and when that time comes, I'll think about it again. But for the next 41 years, I'll probably not think about Stephen Avery or Brendan Dassey at all.
Brendan, do you have any reaction to the sentence? Hope you get out of prison eventually.
Stephen's lawyer is good, and I think she will find out who did it. I'm hoping, I have my fingers crossed, that they'll know the truth, that none of us were involved.
It's just incredible to me that the prosecution was able to pull this off. It is one of the all-time stupid cases. It really, I just don't, I just cannot imagine how people put this together. It's fascinating. Because I don't like blaming juries, because I think the jury system really works. It really works if they know, if they've got the evidence, they don't make mistakes like this. This can only be attributed to them not being given the evidence.
Anybody want to take a shot at that about the jury that she just made there?
Well, I mean, Kathleen Turner does make a valid point here, guys. If the jury hears the evidence. But the problem is that there was no forensic evidence against Brendan Dassey. The actual trial itself was just another mini rerun of Stephen's trial. It had exactly the same witnesses, had the same state forensic experts. It was completely bizarre. So the state must have been looking at this and thinking, wait a minute, there's actually nothing forensically that ties Brendan to Teresa Halbach. And the only thing that they could have thought about was the fact that Brendan had admitted doing these things just by words. And even though Brendan had, I would say, the gumption to get on the stand and recant, it obviously didn't convince the jury. So, yeah, there was no forensic evidence against Brendan Dassey, yet the jury still convicted him. And remember, Jack61, they found him guilty of mutilation of a corpse.
That's right.
They don't make mistakes like this. This can only be attributed to them not being given the evidence.
The number one reason why this is the primary burn location is that on October 31st, Mr. Avery had a big whopping fire there on the 31st of October. And we haven't heard any evidence of a big whopping fire, the kind that would fully consume a human body anywhere else on that property. That's the primary burn location, ladies and gentlemen. You can find that, and you should find that beyond a reasonable doubt. That shouldn't be a question for you.
I wanted to find the leading expert on burning bodies. I talked to a couple of forensic anthropologists, and I kept getting the same name, Dr. John DeHaan. There isn't anybody in the world that knows more about burning bodies than he does.
I've had the opportunity to observe a number of human cadavers burned under a variety of conditions. And I know what it takes to keep a body burning and what it takes to accomplish a certain amount of destruction. What happens is that if it's in an open pit, the heat that you generate from burning the fuel basically is largely lost. It goes up with the flames and the smoke. And as a result, you have to keep adding more fuel to keep the fire going.
On the 31st of October at about 7:30 to 7:45 p.m., did you notice anything unusual around the property at that time?
Yes, I did.
Could you tell the jury what you saw at that time, please?
I saw a big fire
And can you tell the jury where you saw the fire, please?
right there.
Are you able to estimate how high or how tall the flames were as you were watching there about 7:45?
They're almost as tall as the garage.
So
10 feet. I don't know, 10 feet maybe. 10 feet tall the flames were.
big fire.
It's a big fire.
Do you see Stephen Avery standing next to or near that fire?
Yes, I did.
The prosecutor wanted the jury to visualize Stephen Avery standing outside of a big bonfire with the flames over the roof of the garage. To you, is that credible, that image?
No, the height of a flame in open air is of ordinary combustibles is driven by the amount of fuel that you have. Basically, the size of the fire controls the height of the flames. And one of the mythologies about destroying a body is if I pour gasoline on it, that's a really hot fire and that's going to destroy the body. Well, no. I mean, the gasoline burns off in a couple of minutes, scorches the outer surfaces of the skin, and goes out.
So it just goes out.
It just goes out.
And again, it all goes back to what he taught me years ago, over a decade ago. It's atmosphere. It's a flat pit. It's really not protected on the sides or anything. So all the energy is going to the atmosphere, and so there's nothing concentrating that fire or keeping that fire next to the body.
So to have flames in an open area 12 or 15 feet high or higher would require an enormous fuel load.
What kind of fuel would be required? How many gallons would you have?
You'd have to have a continuous supply. You'd have to have,
you have to have hundreds of gallons,
yes.
right? You'd have to have a fuel tank.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's huge though, because I mean, the state told the jury that the remnants of a couple tires were found and that the body could actually be essentially cremated with tires put on it as the fuel source. I mean, do you think that's possible?
This looks like the remains of maybe 2 tires. Well, those will help keep a body burning, but they are not going to be a primary fuel to achieve this kind of destruction. If you're fueling it with dozens of car tires, you're going to have visible remains of all the steel elements of the car tires. You'd also have, if you're fueling this with solid fuels, you're going to have a lot of ash.
If you're going to burn up a body and have a huge fire for hours, just think about it. You're going to have debris everywhere. And it may not even be body debris, but there's going to be other stuff burning. And you should be able to see what some of that is.
So when we talk about negative evidence, so there's just a complete absence of any fuel source that would have reduced the body to this state that it's discovered in.
That's right. The other thing is, if you keep a fire burning with a human cadaver, no matter what kind of fuel you're adding, the combustion of the tissue, especially the fat, creates a black brown goo, and so you're going to end up with a stain when you burn a body on open ground.
So at this scene, if they'd had any experts present, this whole theory might never have gotten off the ground, right?
That's right. Any experienced crime scene person would be able to recognize that the thermal damage and the residual materials that should be present if there was a large fire here enough to consume a body to this extent, they're not there.
Well, it's rather remarkable what Scott Tadich said. I mean, you think about it. Scott Tadich there was there to get Barb, right? Because I think they went out either to see his mother at the hospital, or I know that Scott Tadich came over and picked up Barb. Now, what on earth is Scott Tadich going to be doing looking at a fire, right? I mean, think about it. He was there to pick up Barb. He wasn't there to look at any fire. And what's remarkable is the level of detail that Scott Tadich said. He specifically said that he noticed Stephen standing next to a fire with around about 10-foot flames. Now, if you've ever stood in front of a barbecue, just a barbecue with the small flames, you know you're going to get cindered being very in close proximity to a barbecue, right? It's going to be fully protected. Now, imagine standing next to a bonfire that has flames 10 or so feet tall. You're going to get cindered. And the other thing, of course, was not only was Bear's kennel out there, right? The dog could have gone up and smoked, but there was a big fat propane tank right next to the burn pit. So maybe Scott Tadich thought that Stephen Avery had opened up the propane tank and had a direct pipe going to the burn pit, because as you see what Dahan said, what's important, if you're going to convert a human being to that level of cremains, you need crematorium type of heat. One of the problems with that burn pit, as I'm sure everyone will agree, is that it was a very small burn pit. It was relatively flat, but it was open, which means the more fuel that you put in, a lot of the combustibles and the heat, instead of being directed to the body, which you need in a professional crematorium, all the heat is going to the atmosphere, right? So to convert a human being to those level of cremains, you need a high fuel load and you need time, both of which Stephen Avery didn't have. High fuel load and also a lot of time to tend to the fire. And as you can see, guys, we only have a box of bones. Jack 61, did they forget to inform anybody to come to the burn pit? When these
They sure did. They sure did. Doc, can you imagine, just to add to what you're talking about and what Dahan said, can you imagine if Beating and String had gotten Wells to approve a trip out, wherever, build and have a little small pit burn area like Avery's and light a fire that was 10-foot high flames and see how close the jury could get to it? I believe that would have ended that conversation.
It
in the bottle.
But what is so disingenuous here, guys, is, and we all know the story, the state coroner was prevented from attending the Stephen Avery salvage yard at all. If Deborah Kakach stepped foot on the salvage yard, she would have been arrested. So she wasn't there at the time that the cremains were found. 2, no photographs were done of the cremains that were found in the burn pit, because Erdl said, remember what he said, Jack 61? He said, we don't take photographs when something has been obviously disturbed.
That's right.
Right. How in the hell could someone disturb the burn pit if they were the first ones that discovered it, right? So that whole scenario doesn't hold water, right? And as Dahan said, when you burn a human body, you leave pyrolysis material. That's your fat, other organs and tissues that have burned down to the ground as a black goo. There was none of that. And the biggest sin that the state committed is that a couple of days after the bones were found, they brought in bobcats to flatten the entire burn pit. So Jack 61, unfortunately, they couldn't invite the jury to have a look at the burn pit because the state bulldozed it away.
They destroyed it. Yeah, it's gone.
Completely gone.
You know, as you think about the pieces of evidence that point to the frame up and Stephen and Brendan's innocence, this is one of the big ones in my mind. The fact that Doc just went over that there wasn't enough fuel and there wasn't enough time means that came from somewhere else. Those bones, and one of the theories that Zellner had put out was that they were dumped out of some other barrel, right? That was brought over, or some container, perhaps a bucket, perhaps another burn barrel. But when you don't have an in situ picture or any type of marking, as they tend to do in a forensic dig site, that tells you where the bones were picked up from, there's really no way to tell sort of the spill pattern that might have been achieved. Who knows what we might have found if they had actually done this investigation properly? It might have readily pointed to the fact that these were planted by some means of tossing them out of a bucket or a barrel. We'll just never know because of the incompetence of the investigators, which keeps on coming through in spades.
Yep, and I think that's a very good point, Big Jeff. And the other big clue, of course, two big clues, actually three, was that not all the cremains were actually in the burn pit. The very first bone that was found in the grass near the burn pit, which is indicative that, like you said, possibly someone was carrying cremains in some type of vessel and had spilt some along the way. Right, so all the human cremains or the cremains were not in the burn pit. Secondly, cut, burnt human cremains were found in Yonder burn barrel number 2. And of course, there were cremains found at the Manitowoc County gravel pit, which Dr. Eisenberg refused to classify as human, even though there is a report where she said that they were human cremains. And Jack 61 will tell you, there's that search warrant that talks about the cremains or bones that were found, you guessed it, at Cuss Road.
Not to mention the Christmas jail call where Stephen, I can't remember whether it was Christmas Day or Christmas Eve, but Stephen calls Barb's house and talks to everybody. One of those people he talks to is Scott Tadich, and he asked Scott Tadich specifically, does he remember the fire from that night? He asked him about how big it was, and Scott Tadich says, "Well, it was about as big as a coffee table." A far different answer than he just gave in trial, and his answer was blown up by Dean and Jerry, anyways, right? I mean, at the end of the day, that testimony,
Correct.
When they refresh his memory with his original statement, they ask him specifically, what's probably more true, what you remember now or what you said right after the incident? He says, yeah, probably back then, I guess, and it's just a snarky response and, waltzes off the stands. So, it's at best, he was being pressured by by law enforcement and just was unwilling for whatever reason to push back, or maybe he honestly misremembered, but that's not the type of thing that you misremember in my mind.
This coached statement, as I call it, that I feel strongly that he was put on and pressured by Ken Kratz to make, and for whatever reason he agreed to do so. I won't go into those motivations because I don't know them, but nonetheless he made them, and then he had to basically walk it back.
Yeah, so basically, the more statements he gave, the fire got bigger.
Yeah, but I agree. And I'm not going to justify for that exaggeration from him. I'm really not, but he's not the only one. There is a pattern with all the witnesses that got up on stage. Well, stand. You even had Blaine on the stand, and he was talking about seeing Uncle Stephen with a burning fire and putting a plastic bag into there and seeing it on like flames and smoke, and that same barrel ends up having Teresa's electronics burnt in it. So, and then you've got Josh Radant, who interviews with KZ, and which will be most likely coming up very shortly in one of these episodes, where and I think he even has wrote an affidavit to it now, swearing to it, that he was pressured. He was pressured into exaggerating the fire, although he was the first one to even bring up a fire on the 31st, and he said this as early as the 5th. But he even says, like, basically, I asked them, what do you want me to say? Do you want me to say it's bigger? So he caught on from their energies what they were wanting him to do, and so he rolled with it. Clearly, we have Bobby Dassey situation, which it's straightforward. There seems to be a twist and a few little porkies and exaggerations on the stand, and you know what I mean? So although Scott's is in our face and we all identify that he has exaggerated, but they all did. He's not one of one. He is one of many. And that's what hurt Stephen in the run, when it wasn't just one that was willing to exaggerate. It was a cluster of witnesses that went beyond to hurt him.
Yes, I agree, Kelly. It's a whole, you got to take it not as a single statement, but multiple statements from multiple people. And none of them actually made any sense, because Brendan Dassey said that he walked up to the burn barrel. This is Stephen Avery's burn barrel, for some unknown reason, as he was coming home from school from the bus, and that he walked up to the barrel. He never mentioned about the fire. And he said that he was able to see the burnt electronics through plastic bags that were on top. And you have to ask the question, why would Brendan Dassey all of a sudden be interested in Stephen Avery's burn barrel, right? And then you've got Blaine, who talked about smoke and fire coming from the burn barrel. And, we know how Blaine was. He recanted, and he wrote up an affidavit for Kathleen Zona, and he said all these things. So the question is, who do you believe, right? Who do you believe? It's a whole bunch of terrible actors in this shocking play, and the poor victims here, apart from Teresa, of course, is Stephen and Brendan.
Yeah, just quickly on the Blaine thing, because I think that I've seen it come up a few times. Yeah, he definitely recanted, and I just want to highlight that what Dr. Silkman said. He's now come forward and said, listen, I kind of exaggerated a little bit. I was pressured by the cops, but I want to recant. His recantation itself doesn't still take away the foundation of hate from Stephen. He doesn't ever say that he never not saw anything. All he does is when he recants is he just says that he doesn't see the smoke. He still sees Stephen putting a plastic bag into that barrel. He just downplays it to it wasn't so much smoking as he alluded to on the stand. So although he took the opportunity to come forward and go, listen, I definitely exaggerated, it still doesn't completely not hurt Stephen. The other thing is, I just wanted to backstep a little bit. I was waiting for the right opportunity, but I might as well just insert it here. And that's just going on about what the Kathleen and her expert was talking about in terms of a fire. And Dr. Silkman explained it so perfectly in terms of the combustion and all the fire and all that. But I want to just identify something that a lot of us always talk about, and that would be the smell. No one mentions the smell. Everyone is logic enough to know that there would be a smell, but what kind of smell? I work in emergency. I've had to deal with burning bodies, and they've come in. The two that I have witnessed, they were of different fuelants. And what I'm going to say to that is that has a lot to do with the smell you're going to get. So the pungent that you get isn't so much the body. Once the body gets past the first few layers of fat and the hair and all that, and that's usually your first that real first pungent smell, because it's getting through all the fibers and the hairs. And everyone knows that when you're a kid and you used to burn hair, you'd go, oh, that stinks, burnt hair. And that's the same, like, but it's the fuelant itself that's used. So there's been people that have said in cases that someone has burnt their wife out the back of their own home and buried them, burnt them amongst wood. And it's like they said it was just like smelling a really a barbecue. It was like a barbecue smell going through the air, and no one explains it as pungent as oh, I couldn't stand the smell, but it was definitely a smell that they knew was it hit their senses. Now, when I have had bodies come in, and I have to say that as tragic as this is, these two gentlemen were separate incidences, and they both were still alive at that stage. One had tried to commit suicide, and this is very, very delicate. So I want to put out a disclaimer to the few little stories, and I'll kind of bring in the details so I'm not going too much. But he had tried to commit suicide, and he put gas in. He let the gas out in his house, and he was trying to gas himself out. But for some reason, a spark had happened, and it went boom and blew up. So he was burnt alive by gas. So when he came in, although his skin was completely off and the smell of the gas was what was so making us all vomit. And then when the other one was a meth lab, a gentleman was cooking meth in a little shed at the back, and it exploded. So when he came in, he had this really pungent smell of chemicals that was like mixed with like the hair burning and the flesh burning and blood, and it was like this really really weird coin smell. You know how people say, like, because of the iron in your blood it smells like coins? I don't know how to explain it, because I don't know if this Australian coins smell the same as American coins or pennies or whatever you guys call them, but it has this really metallic smell to it and taste, especially blood, because of the iron and stuff. And that's what he came in with, was this really pungent chemical smell, mixed with obviously all the burning fibers and the skin. So my objective to that is, I think that if Teresa was burnt by a method of fuel itself, whether it's unleaded or whatever, that would give a different texture and it would release a different pungent and smell into the atmosphere and what it is you would be smelling. If she was being burnt in terms of direct heat and wood and scrubs and stuff, again, I think that would honestly come off more like a barbecue once you got through that initial burn off. Once you get past all that, and then you get down to the certain organs and then the bones, I think by that stage, the smell would have passed. There is one part of our organs that no matter how it happens, once it breaks open, it does spread, and that is your intestines, your bowel intestines. It is so foul, like I can't even explain it. And I have had to smell it, and it's next level. But again, depending on what you're getting burnt with, that could override that in terms of it's open. But I personally, no one here believes that she was burnt in a pit. So if any of this burning did occur, it was most likely contained in a burn barrel. Therefore, you're containing the smell, you're containing the fire, and you're able to add fuel to it and keep it alight and maintain it. But I just wanted to touch base on those things. So I'm glad you guys let me do that.
Just to add to a little bit more, it's gross, and I apologize for any trigger warnings and all that kind of thing out there. But I also have to consider, and I'm not in your field, just knowing and talking with people that have witnessed and been around this kind of thing. But consider the internal organs and the odor that would create, which I think would be really horrendous. I don't know that, never experienced it, but I've talked to people that have, and it's something you gets in your nose, your olfactory senses, and you never forget it. It's always there.
Absolutely, it's more the bowel intestines. It's like rotting. It's beyond rotting. It's like the next level
putrid.
of rot. It's putrid to the point that you actually vomit. And the other thing that I just want to touch base on is you got to remember there is another factor into it, and that's decomposition. Like whether trees have been buried for a day or two before someone made the decision to dismember and then cut her up and then burn her. Because again, if you're into decomposition, your gases and all that are a focal point, and if they're popping and exploding and things are happening there, that's another smell in itself. Coroners have gone to cases and they've picked up evidence and they've bagged evidence and they've put it into a bag. And I never forget the one that I read. It was an Australian forensics pathologist, and she was one of the very first women in Australia that did it. And it's an excellent book, and she talks about all her crime scenes. And she does say that there was this one case where she went to a road accident, and the road accident, she had to collect like the debris of like the car, the wreckage itself, and she put it in the back of her vehicle, and she was taking it to the lab. And for some reason, when she got there, the bags had moved, and one of the bags had kind of like opened up on the side, and she put all the pieces back into the bag. And she said, I tried not to contaminate us, but it was already a little bit iffy. But what had happened was a little bolt that she had recovered from the crime scene and the wreckage, which had one of the victim's blood all over it, had rolled out and got under the bonnet or the boot department. And she said for the next few days she could smell this really weird rusty kind of scent, and she couldn't work out what it was. Later to find out that it was that that screw from the bolt from the car wreckage that had a victim's blood all over it, and it was letting off like this really pungent smell. So again, it's little things like that we know it's there, but we don't factor it in enough. It's just a tragedy just to think that someone went to the level to do that to someone. It takes away the dignity of her as a human, and it's really tragic to think that someone could do that to another human being. It's almost it's like an animal would do that, but a human should not be doing that to another human.
Yeah, I 100% agree. This is what fascinates me about this particular crime, the utter brutality of it. It's definitely an overkill, and one has to ask the question why. I think the answer is pretty obvious: to remove any traces of forensic evidence leading to the killer or killers, right? But we mustn't forget a couple of things. One, around about 50 to 60% of the skeletal remains are missing, right? The entire skeleton hasn't been recovered. The entire skeletal remains haven't been recovered. And as you know, right, and Kelly and everyone will back me up on this, you burn a human body in one spot, you will tend to find the entire human skeleton, in pieces, but in the one spot. And what we have in this particular instance is the fact that skeletal remains have been dispersed, right? So the skeletal remains haven't been in one spot. They're not in the burn pit. The only thing that we've got is that box of bones. We don't know what parts of Teresa Halbach were cremated, right? She could have been totally, I know it sounds gross, but all her internal organs could have been removed, right? And that in turn will lessen the smell, because if the internal organs are gone and they were disposed in some other manner, then we absolutely know that there are cut marks on her bones. which means that she was dismembered. So likely to transport a dismembered body is much, much easier, right, guys? The body's in fragments. And I agree with Kelly. The perfect vessel to cremate a human body and convert them into small bone fragments is a burning barrel. Why? Because you can put in a high fuel load, it gets extremely hot, and you direct the heat onto the body, which is exactly what you don't get very well in an open burn pit. So if you can concentrate the heat on the body parts, and remember, it's going to be easier to cremate if the body's cut up into small pieces. You've got a bigger surface area instead of an entire body. It's going to be easier to burn down. And just as an aside, in a professional crematorium, it can reach levels of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And studies have shown that you need approximately 2 hours. So you need direct heat, as in a flame source like gas, and a sustained period of time to convert a human being into those small cremains, right? But we know there's evidence that she was dismembered. Now, when Brendan Dassey was asked, what did you do? Brendan, remember Jack 61, Brendan Dassey said, I picked her up from the feet, Stephen picked her up from the shoulders, and we put her in the fire whole.
That's right.
How on earth can you get saw cut marks, hesitation cut marks through bones if they allegedly put Teresa Horbach whole in that burn pit? You know that cannot be the case. Whereas if you dismember the body, gut out the body, it's easier to transport. You put them in a burn barrel, no one's going to see you, right? And as you know, people burn rubbish, but people also burn animal parts, right, Jack 61?
That's right.
What did Dassey say? We burn the
right,
heads.
That's right. They burned the heads of the deer in the burn barrel.
Right. So if you co-burn animal parts with human body parts, maybe what Kelly was alluding to is correct. Depending on the fuel source, it may smell like a barbecue, right? So you've got this weird thing whereby we've just got a box of bones, about 60% of the skeletal remains are missing, and, correct me if I'm wrong, but 35% of the skull was recovered. Where's the rest of the skull, and why are all the teeth crowns missing? All the crowns of the teeth are missing.
I think I'm just going to slip in here on behalf of Kath, because I know when she hears this part of the podcast, she'll start ripping out her hair again. Isn't that ironic, though? Just another man miracle, as Big Jeff would like to say, that we have 35% of her skull is recovered, yet it has to be the 35% that is needed to determine a bullet wound went through her skull. Like,
that's right.
Why couldn't it have been the other side where it was just like, oh well, here's her skull, but we still don't know a cause of death. But no, it has to be the 35% coverage where a bullet goes through, not one, but two, and then insert. Oh, now we need to find the bullet. Enter item FL. Like, just man miracle 101. Over to you, Big Jeff. Take it away.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And when you think about it, wouldn't you think that sort of the part that had a hole in it, or the spot that was sort of exposed, would be the one that would sort of burn away and decay first, right? So wouldn't that, that beveling, the area of the skull with the beveling, wouldn't that have been exposed first and sort of be the one that sort of turns to ashes first? So yeah, it's kind of miraculous. You've got really, people like to throw around a lot of names, but you've got this two in the hat, and you've got this total annihilation of any evidence that could possibly link you to the killer through this dismembering and burning. It almost sounds like a hit.
I agree with Kelly, and I could just imagine Calf, she'll be going bananas. But, the reality is this, right? They're all cryptic clues. They're all cryptic clues. For example, you had the cranial bone fragments with evidence of beveling in 2 locations, one in the back of the skull and one on the left side near the temple, which is a classic execution style hit. I mean, why on earth would Stephen Avery shoot Teresa Halbach twice like that? And according to Brendan, he had shot her a total, I think, Jack 61 of between 10 and 11 times, which completely doesn't make any sense whatsoever in the garage, and they found not one drop of Teresa Halbach's blood. But what's bizarre here is that there were bones that were left behind that Dr. Bennett was able to definitively tell that it was from an adult human female, right? The skeleton of a male and a female, it's essentially identical, except there are diagnostic bones between the sexes. And it just so happened that a pelvic bone was found that Dr. Bennett was able to say, yep, these are the remains of an adult human female, because the female pelvic bone has got a certain shape, angle, etc., etc. Yet, intriguingly, there were pelvic bone fragments found at the Manitowoc County gravel pit where the bones were articulated. That means they were joined together. It's I think it's the only instance in this case where 2 bones were joined together. The rest were just separate bone fragments. Dr. Eisenberg refused to classify them as human. Because think about it, guys, we'll talk about this later. How was the state going to explain why part of Teresa Halbach's pelvis was in the burn pit and the other one was down the road in the Manitowoc County gravel pit? Right? They were both pelvic fragments. They didn't look like deer pelvises or animal pelvises because human bones have got a specific anatomy, yet Dr. Eisenberg refused to classify them.
Positive that this burn pit is not the primary burn site of Teresa Halbach's body.
That's correct. Yes, this cannot be the primary burn site.
Dr. DeHaan is very clear that it was impossible for her body to have been cremated in that burn pit, and that he was positive that no human body had ever burned in that burn pit because of the lack of ash and the lack of residue of the body that he's seen in every single one of the burned body cases he's done. And he's done more of those than anyone in the world. And of course, the whole fishy thing about the burn pit is there are no photographs of the discovery of the bones. Why would you transport from the crime scene the evidence and not document and photograph and meticulously record the composition of the bones and all of that? Why wasn't that done?
That's your shit show right there. 1, prevent the state's coroner from coming onto the property, who would have brought her own forensic team, her own forensic experts. That's 1. 2, no in situ photographs. That tells you right there that what we have in that box, the bones that we have in that box, we have no idea of the origin. You're basically reliant on what Ertl said. And not only that, the crazy thing was when they were collating these bones, because they used a sieve. Remember Jack 61, about 5:30 when it started to get dark, they all packed off and pissed off.
That's right. That's right. Done. Dinner time, guys. Get the fuck out of here.
They pressed the bell. Right, everyone home. Now, guys, crime scene 101. The first person you call when you see a bone and you don't know what it is either a forensic anthropologist or the state bloody coroner. You do not start digging up cremains, sifting them and putting them in a box, right? You never do that. You grid them, you photograph them, and guess what, guys? We don't even have a video, right, to show the discovery of those bones in the burn pit. Everything has been done incognito. The question must be asked, why?
They treated the burn pit the same way they did the RAV. Why didn't they video going into that RAV and what they found immediately? It didn't memorialize that. They did the same thing there.
Define what they meant by the burn pit was already disturbed. Well, who disturbed it? Why did they disturb it? And why wasn't anyone held accountable then for tampering into a crime scene by doing shit to it that hadn't been properly, like Dr. Silkman and Jay Jack just said, gridded, photographs. Like, no one actually turned around and said, well, who touched this crime scene? Who touched my crime scene? And why the hell did you do it? And the irony of that is, and I've said this a few times, so sorry for repeating myself for the people that are like, yeah, we've heard you say this, but for the new ones that haven't, that for me is the only time in this case where I think you could have a good amount of maybe, whether it's not, maybe circumstantial proof that framing happened, whether you believe that was from the law enforcement themselves or from the killer, because it's the only time that we hear that something was out of the ordinary, that they noticed that the crime scene didn't look like it should have been. So why didn't anyone get to the bottom of it? Then who made it look like that? Was it because the law enforcement stumbled upon the killer trying to frame Stephen Avery, and so they all just assumed that one of their own had done it and missed the part that someone had just dumped the bones there and it was out of the ordinary? Or did someone go in there as law enforcement and start poking around when they had no right to do it and broke protocol? Because the protocol should have been exactly what Dr. Silkman said. You get the coroner to come in, and I know Ken Kratz thinks that all you do is kick the body, but their job is beyond kicking a body. Their job is to capture a crime scene. They do measurements, they take photos, they grid, they do all of it. Their whole objective is to go in and basically screenshot that crime scene, so then they can go back and whether they put it in a diagram or any kind of 3D format later, they recreate it so then they can review it if they have to go back and go, in my findings, this is out of the ordinary, or this is the angles or stuff like that. But someone took that opportunity away. So again, I think the only thing that really does my head in about that burn pit is, for the first time ever, the law enforcement has some explaining to do in just that alone. Who touched it and why? And if it wasn't you guys, how did you miss the fact that someone else had put bones there? Because it would have been clearly obvious that it didn't belong.
Yeah, it was startling that when everyone started poking around. Remember, and please correct me, guys, if I'm wrong, but as I recall, the series of events was Joust saw this whatever outside the edge of the burn pit. He goes and gets Sturdivant and Sipple. Sturdivant comes over and starts poking around in the fire pit, and away they went. They were off to the races. They didn't stop right then and say, wait, we need to get the proper people in here and document this. And so then when Earl comes along, he says, oh, well, the crime, this has already been disturbed, so we don't photograph it. Well, bullshit. You asked the guy to demonstrate what he had done, and you continue on. Now, if they went there with a bunch of shovels and stuff, that'd be different, but I don't think that this series of events happened that way. But anyway, at trial, remember, Doc? Remember, guys? Yes. Sturdivant fell on his sword and admitted to what he had done and took the fall.
And he basically wanted to take the blame for everything, because
that's right.
Asked, did you call a coroner? No. Did you call a forensic anthropologist? No. Did you take any photographs? No. And he basically admitted he was the fall guy. Hey, what are they going to do to me anyway? They're not going to do anything to me. And so all we have is that box of cremains, and you must trust law enforcement for doing the right thing and that they sifted those cremains from that burn pit. But let me tell you right now, the most important photographs that you'll find of that burn pit were done by Trooper Reese, who accidentally took the pictures of the burn pit with bears standing over them on November the 6th.
That's right.
They are the only in situ photographs, because on November the 6th, they had no idea that the burn pit was in play, right? And what is interesting, I'm not sure whether it was Erdl or Sturtevant that they asked in trial. They said, can you describe how you saw those cremains in the burn pit? And remember Jack 61, he said they were a pile in the middle of the ash. They were
That's
a
right.
pile of remains sitting on the ash, and you think to yourself, wait a minute, Trooper Reese took pictures of the burn pit, and there clearly is not a bunch of cremains in the middle of that ash. So someone tampered with the crime scene, guys, or dumped the cremains.
And don't forget about this last round of calls that we got. Sipple getting a hold of Jost to get their story straight about who did what. That was another call that we got that's very interesting.
Correct. And there's also mentioning of buckets, and that's how they believed Stephen moved these cremains. He was attempting to move the cremains. Well, why can't those buckets have been used to add the cremains to the burn pit?
It's also interesting in this pile of receipts that we got that I don't remember who did it. I don't know if it was Rush or one of the other. It was one of the other officers had went to Menards or somewhere and bought like 15 or 20 5-gallon buckets. Did you know that? They did.
Yes, I knew that.
Yes.
To me, I think about as they're doing this, at what point do they say, should we be taking photos or should we be calling in the Bobcat? You know what I mean? So, as you say, sift through the remains is kind of a humorous way to put it when you actually bring in a Bobcat to excavate the dirt to dig the thing up, totally destroying the crime scene. It's just unbelievable.
The irony of it is when everyone's originally talking about the burn pit, they say it's only so many meters by so many meters, like a table. I think they even tell Stephen that, don't they? Like even the law enforcement say it's only the size of like a coffee table, and then by the time they're finished with it, you could put a pool in there. You just need to go buy a pool and you could have an in-ground pool. They've already done all the hard yards for you. And then they delivered in the courtroom, they delivered those pictures of it being massive to make it almost look like that is what it was. That it was this big ass burning inferno to match the stories that all these witnesses were saying, that it was this big, big bushfire thing happening. So again, I agree with Big Jeff here in terms of the Bobcat. That was like next level bullshit.
Correct. And so hence what you're doing is not only are you tampering with the evidence, you're destroying the crime scene. So in reality, imagine if the jury took a tour bus, say the burn pit was preserved, and the jurors went out there to have a look at the Avery salvage site, the trailer, the garage, and the burn pit. All of them would have been shaking their head thinking, you've got to be joking, right? So by destroying the actual burn pit, no one can do reconstructions, i.e. potentially burn a cadaver, because that's what they do. They say, all right, let's see if we can reproduce what Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey allegedly did. What do we need for this to happen? Keeping in mind that Stephen was phoned twice by Jody at crucial times. Right, Jack 61? She phoned him twice for 15 minutes, which means he couldn't have been tending the fire. Otherwise, you would have heard crackling, hissing, all sorts of stuff. He clearly wasn't tending a fire during those 30 minutes. So what happened? Did the fire go out? Did he lose control of the crime scene? Could his mum have come up and seen him saying, "Oh, Stephen, what are you doing in what's burning in the burn pit?" The whole thing is so ridiculous. I can't believe we're even entertaining this. It's crazy.
And that's the irony of it, though. Like Dr. Silkman was going on the lines like, the burn itself. And but here's the catch, the irony, the thing that I could get my head going around the burn pit is you'd have to believe, though, if Stephen had done that the bones were always in that pit. And the reason why I bring, I can't help but I can't entertain that being on the basis that, and it goes for the killer as well. If law enforcement doesn't have anything to do with shifting and moving of the bones and bringing it over, and it purely was the killer, then that means that they would have most likely had to have had done it before the morning of the 5th, before the Avery Savage Yard gets locked down and everyone gets taken off and no one can come back on. And that's what gets my brain going when I start thinking, because I think, hang on a minute, that would mean that the bones were there the entire time or days leading up to the 5th, because someone had already put them there if it wasn't law enforcement. So what the hell would have happened if, say, Stephen, because you can't control the universe and you can't control someone's narrative and their sliding door moments. We hear that the boys were talking about wanting a bonfire on that Friday night, and Blaine wanted to bring a chick, but Stephen or someone said no, and it never ended up happening. So this is what gets me going, is the fact that what would have happened, the killer would have had to have some balls to put the bones in the pit and risk that someone like even Bear see a bone and be like, oh, and take it and start gnawing on it, and then someone walking past and go, what the hell are you eating? And it's like a skull, or something on the lines of Stephen going, all right, I'm going to burn some more scrub today, and he's starting to set up the fire and then looking down and going, what the hell's this? So that's what triggers me, is the fact that nobody, and I mean nobody, can control the narrative of someone else's life. Yet we must have to then believe, and the state want us to believe, that Stephen had her body in that pit sitting there since the 31st. And there's all these people that are walking around and not one person not sees it, because you don't always have to go to a burn pit, but things like rubbish. Someone's like, oh, I'm just going to go throw this on the pit, so when you light it up in a few weeks, Stephen, it goes away. Yet it just mind boggles me. I know it's an extra detail that kind of doesn't have anything to do with what we're watching now, but it's these details that is part of the state's narrative as well, because they want us to believe that from the 31st, the night of the 31st, that Teresa, her remains, after have been burnt and toasted, was still sitting in that pit that entire time. Yet Stephen took all his time and energy to clean up his trailer so perfectly, not one trace of her was left, yet he left, although a portion of her remains, but still her remains behind in his pit at the back of his doorstep for another 5 days without attending to them and going, right, now they're done, I need to get them off the property. Do you see where I'm going with that?
Yep, and the same logic, twisted logic, applies for the RAV4. So that means that, according to the state's narrative, not only was her RAV4 on the property on the 31st, also her cremains were there, right, from the 31st, and no one, absolutely no one, none of the brothers, none of the nephews, No one coming in from the public, neither his mother nor father saw anything nefarious in the burn pit, in his trailer, in his garage, and at the pit. And they were down there. They were down there because they were sighting in their rifles, going in rabbit hunting. And Earl even said, remember, guys, Earl said, hey, we were down there. We didn't see any RAV4, right? We would have noticed it. So you've got this bizarre situation, and it's crystal clear in my mind. What happens before the cremains are found? What key event happens one day before everything is found? What is it, Jack 61? What's that key event that is surrounded by woods?
Cuss Road.
Cuss Road.
Yep, Cuss Road. Sorry.
You got to go off mute, Jack.
Couldn't find the unmute button.
Yep. Cuss Road. So, of course, that's another podcast altogether. But it's intriguing, the timeline. And as what Kelly alluded to, if Stephen and Brendan were the killers, that means that they left the two biggest forensic evidence gold mines sitting out in the open from October the 31st.
If the body didn't get burned in the burn pit, what's another possibility?
The best thing, of course, is to put it in some sort of enclosure, preferably metal, that will reflect the radiant heat back into the location of the body. And that assures that there's enough radiant heat continuing to play on the surface of the body to keep the fuel supply coming. There have been a number of cases across the U.S. where bodies have been disposed of in a front yard burn barrel. I was actually kind of surprised to see how efficient the process was, and it turns out that from a thermal energy standpoint, they're successful for exactly the same reason as a commercial crematorium.
These people in this area of Wisconsin, they deer hunt a lot, and one of the things witnesses have said is that when they dress the deer, they usually remove the head, and some of them were burning the heads.
Oh, okay.
So you would figure they would be familiar with the process.
Certainly anybody who routinely uses a burn barrel knows that, a properly ventilated burn barrel will accomplish this kind of destruction.
Yes, it will absolutely cause that kind of destruction because it's enclosed, right? Jack, did you have something you wanted to show?
Put that one slide up that I've got. Yeah, there you go. This is the photo that Reese took on November 6, 2005. So it doesn't match the reports for the trial testimony. I just wanted to show that.
Yeah, that's thank you, Jack 61. That is such a crucial photo. Trooper Reese took a couple, and you can clearly see Bear's not agitated. He's just minding his own business. And plus, they video recorded when they were coming out of the, I think it was the garage, and they walked towards the burn pit. Bear was just continuing on doing his own business. He turned his back towards the law enforcement. He wasn't vicious at all. But the crucial thing is that burn pit had no pile of cremains. You think about it, guys. You burn a human body, you're going to find the cremains in a pile. There was none of them there, right? And so, as Jack 61 said, the narrative they presented in the trial does not reflect the pictures, some of the pictures which Trooper Reese took before the cremains were actually found. Very interesting.
Right. They didn't notice any smell. And I personally think they would have noticed an odor. I think a relatively strong odor if a body had actually been, even if the internal organs and so forth had not been burned there, I still think they would have smelled a barbecue, as Kel explained.
There would have been some evidence of a cremation taking place, right?
Yes.
And none of them got alerted until the very first bone was found outside the burn pit in the grass, And I think the comment was, oh, yeah, my parents worked in a butcher shop and I remember this looked like such and such of a bone. And I'm thinking to myself, for fuck's sake, why don't you call a human anthropologist that knows what remains look like instead of guessing, for God's sake? How amateurish were these guys?
It's a great point, Dr. Silkman. I really like that. But I think we're at that point of the episode where we will have to shoot it on over to Big Jeff to wrap us up for today. A lot of discussion that was had yet today already, Big Jeff.
Well, I think the most important thing to point out is it seems we're very nearly halfway through episode 3 in only 2 podcasts. Did I get that right? This could be a new man miracle for this panel. I think that's wrapping this. So this today's podcast is much more refreshing in my mind than last week's. Last week's was tough with Brendan. But in this one, we certainly got to listen to Kathleen Zellner's experts. Primarily, as we spent a lot of time talking about the burn pit and just eviscerating the state's evidence associated with that. And there's very little associated with the burn pit narrative that makes any sense. He didn't have enough time. He didn't have enough fuel. When did he do it? If you cut up these things into pieces, isn't somebody going to notice that? Yeah, I didn't like that fire in the burn barrel, and it's going to be going at night, and people are going to look and see it. Nobody's reporting anything. When did this happen? If it happened, in his property, he didn't have enough time to do it between the 31st and the time it was discovered, with the amount of traffic that was going on. We didn't even get to Bloodhound Robert Fabian, who said he smelled plastic burning in one of the burn barrels, yet couldn't smell a body burning, 30 feet away from him. So none of this makes sense. This one was much more refreshing than the last one, because the tragedy of Brendan is, and I'm still, distraught from it from last week. But this one is one that gives you optimism, because it sort of renews, in your mind, the fact that that there was a massive setup, and this evidence doesn't make any sense.
No, thank you very much, Big Jeff, for those comments. And Jack, if you could.
Just talking about the burn pit, it just reminds me of everything that we've, as Doc has alluded to, gathered from the photographic evidence, what little we do have, especially the importance of the 2 or 3 photos that Reese took, on the 6th, and then how things kind of fell together, how they cobbled this story together, moving into the 7th, 8th, and then the 9th, and then the reports that were written, the statements from Sturdivant and others, they just don't work. They're not true. And then again, this comment also, I remember it well. Doc talked about it a minute ago. Isn't this some kind of bone? I worked in a butcher shop. Well, if you don't know what the fuck you're talking about, get people in there that do. It's like a shade tree mechanic going to try to work on a McLaren. You don't know what you're doing. Go get the proper people, and they didn't, and they had the opportunity. The coroner, Kel talked about that a little bit. Deb Kakech, even if she didn't have the proper knowledge of what an anthropologist may have, she has the ability to pick up the phone and get the proper people in there to do their job, and she wasn't allowed to do it. I think that's a real red flag. And again, yes, and I have to agree, we're on to things that we can talk about that are not Brendan, and not that I don't want to talk about Brendan. Man, that was tough. That was really hard.
Oh, thank you, Jack. Appreciate that. I agree. The last episode is still ringing in my head as well. Dr. Silkman, if you wouldn't add your wrap-up comments, please.
Yeah, I just want to say that, last week's episode was heartbreaking. It still does me in. And I really enjoyed today's episode. I really love the way the panel members are able to deep dive and bring their knowledge and wisdom to the case. And we're still learning. We don't know all the answers. But for me, there's no question about it. The lack of professionalism in the processing of the burn pit and all the bullshit that was associated with it, or the periphery that was done, not only to the coroner, but all the piss poor excuses of why this wasn't done and why that wasn't done, to me is the height of disrespect. You know, Mr. Kratz keeps on saying, you know, talking about Teresa and her family and the sensitivity. Well, have a look at the way they processed this burn pit, which allegedly had the cremains of their victim. Shocking, amateurish, and disgusting. And it goes to show, guys, the importance of having proper forensic experts on your team. Because had Dr. Dahan been on the defense team, he would have ripped the state a new one. And that was important, guys, because remember, the state are attesting that Teresa, the primary burn site of Teresa, where Teresa got cremated, was the burn pit. And no one had come up with reasonable arguments from the defense to demolish it. Dahan eloquently took it to pieces. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Silkman. And Kelly, why don't you lead us out of episode 12?
Sure. I just want to, two things I want to apologize for. One, my rambling, if I did that. And secondly, for the full disclaimer that I'm sorry if my stories were insensitive or triggering for some people. Again, I just, it's just my experience, and I just want to put forth, and trying to make it make sense to people. And yeah, I agree. Last week's episode compared to this episode is completely a bit of a relief. It was easy to take a breath away from Brendan. And although when we speak about it, Brendan, and how we're glad we're not having to see him or watch that again, it's not that we're taking anything away from Brendan's story. We support him and we want him free, but as most of us are parents and we're all human, we just feel for him, and it's really hard. Thank you for everyone in the panel for talking, and everyone for joining. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kel, and thanks to everybody out there who's been following along with us since the beginning or recently. So for Jack and Kel and Big Jeff and Dr. Silkman, this is Jeff Jones saying this has been Discussing a Murderer.